Good morning. We'll continue with the essay, The Problem That Has No Name by Betty Friedan. As I mentioned in the last class, this particular essay, The Problem That Has No Name, is the first chapter of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. So, in this particular book, which was published in 1963, she kind of destroys the myth of the happy American suburban housewife and mother. So, this book actually sparks off the second wave of American feminism because she tries to demystify the reductive images of women in American magazines. So, this particular essay it delineates the phantom nature of silencing that is involved in patriarchal culture, and it becomes a call to end discrimination. So we'll just look at this essay, The Problem That Has No Name. This problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? So, as I had spoken in the last class, we see how women in America suffered a sense of dissatisfaction. They did everything that was expected of them as a wife and as a mother. But they had this kind of emptiness within themselves, and they felt a kind of strange stirring, a kind of a yearning, a dissatisfaction, but they were not ready to speak that out. I mean, they were actually afraid to speak that out. They were actually afraid to voice their thoughts. They were not even ready to ask themselves, is this all? Is this all that my life is, made of? Do I just have to be a good wife and a mother? But they were not ready to speak that out. Why? Because they were afraid. For over 15 years, there was no word of this yearning in the millions of words written about women. For women, in all the columns, books, and articles by experts telling women their role was to seek fulfillment as wives and mothers. Over and over, women heard in voices of tradition and of Freudian sophistication that they could desire no greater destiny than to glory in their own femininity. Experts told them how to catch a man and keep him, how to breastfeed children and handle their toilet training, how to cope with sibling rivalry and adolescent rebellion, how to buy a dishwasher, bake bread, cook gourmet snails, and build a swimming pool with their own hands, how to dress, look, and act more feminine and make marriage more exciting, how to keep their husbands from dying young and their sons from growing into delinquents. They were taught to pity the neurotic, unfeminine, unhappy women who wanted to be poets or physicists or presidents. They learned that truly feminine women do not want careers, higher education, political rights, the independence, and the opportunities that the old fashioned feminists fought for. Some women in their 40s and 50s still remembered painfully giving up those dreams, but most of the younger women no longer even thought about them. 1,000 expert voices applauded their femininity, their adjustment, their new maturity. All they had to do was devote their lives from earliest girlhood to finding a husband and bearing children. So, in this particular paragraph, we see, how women's roles as mothers and wives have been glorified, right? So nobody ever spoke about the yearning that was there in the minds of women, because only you could find only articles and books telling women that their role was to seek fulfillment as wives and mothers. They heard, even in the traditional voices, even in the voices of Freudian sophistication, that it was a great joy and glory to be feminine, to be a wife and to be a mother, to look after their children, to look after their household, to buy things for their household, to cook meals, to take care of their husbands. This was the greatest thing that they could do. And they were supposed to pity these women, these neurotic, unfeminine, unhappy women who wanted to make a career for themselves, who wanted to be physicians, who wanted to be poets, who wanted to be presidents, because they were taught, even the magazines, the traditional voices, the books, everything that gave the message to them was that such women were unfeminine. right? So they were taught that truly feminine women were women who did not want careers or higher education, right? Truly feminine women were women who yearned to be mothers and wives. There were some women who were 40 and 50, who thought with a lot of pain about giving up these careers and dreams. They remembered with a lot of pain. But the younger women were not even, they did not even have an inkling of what a career was, because from the time that they were born, they were kind of brainwashed into believing that the best thing that they could do for themselves was to find a husband and bear children. Right? So we pass on to the next paragraph. By the end of the 1950s, the average marriage age of women in America dropped to 20 and was still dropping into the teens. 14 million girls were engaged by 17. The proportion of women attending college in comparison with men dropping from 47% in 1920 to 35% in 1958. A century earlier, women had fought for higher education. Now girls went to college to get a husband. By mid 50s, 60% dropped out of college to marry, or because they were afraid too much education would be a marriage bar. Colleges built dormitories for married students, but the students were almost always the husbands. A new degree was instituted for the wives, PhD, putting husband through. Right? So, what happened in the 1950s? The average women in America, average marriage age of women in America dropped to 20. That means girls were from 17 to 20 were getting married. Girls were getting married in their teens. So the number of women attending college fell drastically. In 1920 and 30, women fought for equality. They wanted higher education. But now what people could see was that the number of women going to college fell drastically. It was only men going to college, and even if women went to college, it was they went to find a husband. And they also felt that if they studied too much, they wouldn't get a husband. And it was even when the colleges had dormitories, it was almost always occupied by men or husbands, and women were kind of trained to put husbands through the courses. They had to help their husbands get the degree. The then American girls began getting married in high school, and the women's magazines, deploring the unhappy statistics about these young marriages, urged that courses on marriage and marriage counselors be installed in high schools. Girls started going steady at 12 and 13. In junior high, manufacturers put out brassieres with false bosoms or foam rubber for little girls of 10, and an advertisement for a girl's dress sizes 36X in the New York Times in the fall of 1960, and said she too can join the man trap set. Girls, American teenage girls, were being taught to trap men. Everything, even the brassieres were kind of designed that way that it would seem that they had big bosoms. Even girls of little 10, they were made to wear brassieres of foam rubber so that they would look big, so that they would get husbands. So girls started dating at 12 and 13 because this is what they were taught, that women had to get married and women had to create a niche for themselves as a homemaker and as a mother. So many of these youngsters, young women, young men who got married, they went into a lot of it could be like there were a lot of unhappy marriages, right? And then what did the American society do? They brought about courses on marriage. They started bringing in marriage counselors in high schools, because women started, or girls, I wouldn't say women, girls started getting married in high school. And they were very immature, so it was difficult for them to make marriages work. So many of these marriages kind of deteriorated. They became very unhappy, and the American society, instead of stopping the women from getting married very young, or instead of stopping the girls from getting married in high school, what they did was they brought in counselors and they brought in courses of marriage to help these girls. By the end of the 50s, the United States birth rate was overtaking India's. The birth control movement, renamed Planned Parenthood, was about to find a method whereby women who had been advised that a third or fourth baby would be born dead or defective might have it anyhow. Statisticians were especially astounded at the fantastic increase in the number of babies among college women, where once they had two children, now they had four, five, six. Women who had once wanted careers were now making careers out of having babies. So rejoiced Life magazine in 1956 paying to the movement of American women back to the home. So what happened is, by the end of the 1950s, the birth rate of United States of America shot up, right? And the birth control movement was renamed Planned Parenthood, right? So, it was, women who had been advised initially, it was said that if you have your third or fourth baby, you should plan your parenthood. The birth control movement was started with the ideology to tell women that if you have a third or fourth baby, it could be born defective, it could be born dead. So plan and have birth, make sure that you use birth control. But now what happened is, this birth control movement was renamed Planned Parenthood, and women who were initially advised not to have a third or fourth baby now could be seen having five, six babies, right? And women who wanted to have careers, women who once wanted to have careers, were now seen making careers out of having babies. So what happened is, the magazines of America, they were very happy, and they started writing, congratulatory poems and ideology, and they started writing all kinds of positive notes to these American women who actually decided to give up their careers and go back to home. So home became the center point. In a New York hospital, a woman had a nervous breakdown when she found she could not breastfeed a baby. In other hospitals, women dying of cancer refused a drug which research had proved might save her lives. Its side effects were said to be unfeminine. If I have only one life, let me live it as a blonde. A larger than life size picture of a pretty, vacuous woman proclaimed from newspaper, from magazines, and drugstore ads. And across America, out of every 3 out of every 10 women dyed their hair blonde. They put a dye and made it blonde. They ate a chalk called metrical instead of food to shrink to the size of the thin young models. Department store buyers reported that American women since 1939 had become 3 and 4 sizes smaller. Women are out to fit the dead instead of vice versa, fit the dress instead of vice versa, one buyer said. Right? So what happened is, people started acting funny. In a hospital, when a woman found out that she couldn't breastfeed her child, she started having a nervous breakdown because it was considered unfeminine. A woman who was dying of cancer, she refused to take a drug because the after effects would be unfeminine. And there were, all these kind of advertisements which kind of had all these huge women, pretty women, big bosomed women, blonde women, proclaiming that if I have only one life, let me live it as a blonde. So you see many women dyeing their hair golden. So, and even they started eating all kinds of medicines and taking drugs to kind of shrink to the zero size, to become look like these young models. So, in the shops, people started saying that American women since 1930s, mid 1930s, they had shrunk. They'd become 3 or 4 sizes smaller because that was something that was considered feminine, looking very thin, having blonde hair, being a good wife, being a good mother. Beyond that, there wasn't anything. Right? You couldn't even kind of decide on a career for yourselves. Right? So women were only kind of, they were only focused on their homes, nothing beyond the homes, right? Everything was only home. So, we'll just read that. Interior designers took to designing kitchens with mosaic murals and original paintings, for kitchens were once again the center of women's lives. Home sewing became $1 million industry. Many women no longer left their homes except to shop, shop for their children, or attend a social engagement with their husbands. Girls were growing up in America without ever having jobs outside the home. In the late 50s, a sociological phenomenon was suddenly remarked. A third of American women now worked, but most were no longer young and very few were pursuing careers. They were married women who held part time jobs, selling a secretarial to put their husbands through school, their sons through college, or to help pay the mortgage, or they were widows supporting families. Fewer and fewer women were entering professional work. The shortages in the nursing, social work, and teaching professions caused crisis in almost every American city. Concerned over the Soviet Union's lead in the space race, scientists rooted that America's greatest source of unused brain power were women, but girls would not study physics. It was unfeminine. A girl refused a science fellowship at Johns Hopkins University to take a job in a real estate office. All she wanted, she said, was what every other American girl wanted: to get married, have 4 children, and live in a nice house in a nice suburb, right? So now what happened is we see how the kitchens were being redesigned. It was painted, mosaic murals, paintings, because the kitchen became the center of women's lives. So even people started sewing at home. It became $1 million industry. Women did not leave homes anymore. So what did they do? They were at home. They went out, maybe to shop, maybe to take the children to school, or maybe they attended some engagement with their husbands. Beyond that, there was nothing. So what America saw was a very serious trend. You had a few of these older women working, but the younger women were not working, right? And the older women were they were growing older and older, and none of these younger women were coming into the kind of professional field. So the very few women who worked were married women who had part-time jobs, and that too would be either selling or secretarial, because they wanted to put their husbands through PhD, remember, put their husbands through college, pay their husbands' fees, pay their children's fees, or they were widows. But very, very, very few women started entering professional work. So what happened was there was shortage in all these kind of professional areas, in nursing, in sewing, in social work, teaching professions. There was a lot of crisis. And it was at that time that Soviet Union started, kind of leading in the space race, and the scientists were kind of great concern. They were concerned very much, because they understood that many of these greatest brains, the unused brain power belonged to women, but girls would not come and study, because for them studying physics, studying science was unfeminine. There was a girl who refused to go to Johns Hopkins University, one of the top universities in America, even when she got a science fellowship. The reason was, she said, no, I'll take up a job as a secretary, because I want to fulfill the American ideal of a woman, that is, get married, have 4 children, build a nice house in a little suburb. Not beyond that. No physics for me. Physics is unfeminine. But remember, in the previous paragraph, we talked about women pursuing careers in physics or medicine or nursing or politics were considered neurotic, were considered unfeminine. So none of these women wanted to do that. The suburban housewife, she was the dream image of the young American women and the envy, it was said, of women all over the world. You remember we talked about how this middle class white family moved to the suburbs, right? Because they wanted a small house in the suburbs. They were afraid of nuclear aftermath. So they moved away from the city into the suburbs, and they lived their own lives. It was a very isolated, closeted life. And this suburban housewife, she was made to be the dream image. That is how the media tried to portray her, as the dream image of the young American women. And she was kind of portrayed as the envy of women all over the world. The American housewife, freed by science and labor-saving appliances from the drudgery, the dangers of childbirth, and the illnesses of the grandmother. This is how they portray the American housewife. She is freed. There's so much of labor-saving appliances. She's been saved from drudgery. She doesn't have the dangers of childbirth, right? She doesn't have the illnesses of a grandmother. She's living a very grand life, right? She was healthy, beautiful, educated, concerned only about her husband, her children, her home. She had found true feminine fulfillment. As a housewife and a mother, she was respected as a full and equal partner to man in his world. She was free to choose automobiles, clothes, appliances, supermarkets. She had everything that workers ever dreamed of, right? So, this is what she was, the great American woman or the great American homemaker, a person, a housewife who was respected, who was an equal partner, who had everything. She had all the appliances which would save her from drudgery. She did not have any dangers of childbirth. She was just living a very secluded, happy life in a nice house in the nice suburbs, right? We'll continue. In the 15 years after World War II, this mystique of feminine fulfillment became the cherished and self perpetuating core of contemporary American culture. So, after World War II, what happened? This mystique of the feminine fulfillment became the cherished and self perpetuating core of American culture, right? So, this was what was seen as the ideal. Millions of women lived their lives in the image of those pretty pictures of the American suburban housewife kissing their husbands goodbye in front of the picture window, depositing their station wagon full of children at school, and smiling as they ran the new electric waxer over the spotless kitchen floor. They baked their own bread, sewed their own clothes and their children's clothes, kept their new washing machines and dryers running all day. They changed the sheets on the bed twice a week instead of once, took the rug looking class in adult education, and pitied their poor, frustrated mothers who had dreamed of having a career. Their only dream was to be perfect wives and mothers. Their highest ambition was to have 5 children and a beautiful house. Their only fight to get up and keep their husbands, to get and keep their husbands. They had no thought for the unfeminine problems of the world outside the home. They wanted the men to make major decisions. They gloried in their role as women and wrote proudly on the census blank, occupation housewife. So this is what happened. These women, they had nothing else to do. So this was the kind of image that was created. This was the kind of image that became the cherished and self-perpetuating core of contemporary American culture. So these women, they had these pretty pictures. This was the image that was created. American suburban housewife kissing their husbands goodbye. They have a huge station wagon full of children. They're cleaning the floor. They, having spotless kitchen. They're baking their own breads. They're sewing their own clothes. They're keeping their new washing machines and dryers running. So everything, it was, when they went for classes, it was adult education class. What did they go for? They went on how to make a rug. That is what they learned. Rug hooking classes. Nothing beyond that. And they also pitied their frustrated mothers, because in the previous generation, women were working and they had these careers. And they kind of pitied the women who had dreamed of having a career, because for them the greatest dream, because it was created like that, it was conditioned in the society that way, that the greatest dream or the only dream for a woman would be to have a perfect family, to be perfect wives, perfect mothers. So they enjoyed writing their own, and they never talked about the unfeminine problems. The problems outside the world were unfeminine problems. So they gloried in their role as women, and they wrote very proudly. Whenever they had to write occupation, they would write housewife. It was a matter of great pride for them, right? Okay, next paragraph. For over 15 years, the words written for women and the words women used when they talked to each other while their husbands sat on the other side of the room and talked shop or politics or septic tanks were about problems with their children, or how to keep their husbands happy, or improve their children's school, or cook chicken, or make slip covers. Nobody argued whether women were inferior or superior to men. They were simply different. Words like emancipation and career sounded strange and embarrassing. No one had used them for years. When a French woman named Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called The Second Sex, an American critic commented that she obviously didn't know what life was all about. And besides, she was talking about French women. The woman problem in America no longer existed. Right? So for over 15 years, right? Women, women only talked about what? They only talked about things about their husbands, they talked about their children, how to cook, how to make chicken. They never talked on politics or any other matters, right? They only talked about problems which they had at home, how to keep husbands happy, how to improve their children's education. They never spoke, and there was no question of women being inferior or superior. Women were simply different. The words like emancipation, independence, career, they did not exist at all. And if at all somebody used those words, such women were called neurotic, right? And these words sounded very strange and embarrassing. Nobody had used them. So when Simone de Beauvoir brought out the book titled Second Sex, the American critics said that, what is this woman writing about? She doesn't know what she's writing about. She's talking about French women. Because in America, we don't have this woman problem at all. We are happy. We are living the ideal lifestyle, right? This is what they said. If a woman had a problem in the 1950s and 1960s, she knew that something must be wrong with her marriage or with herself. Other women were satisfied with their life, she thought. What a kind of woman was she if she did not feel, if she did not feel this mysterious fulfillment waxing the kitchen's floor? She was so ashamed to admit her dissatisfaction that she never knew how many other women shared it. If she tried to tell her husband, he didn't understand what she was talking about. So, what we see here is the women were not ready to talk about their dissatisfaction, right? They had a lot of, see, for them, talking about dissatisfaction, it was something which they couldn't even accept it, because for them, they felt that everything was normal and everything was ideal. So talking about something that was dissatisfying in a heart was something, something wrong for them. So they were actually made to find fulfillment in waxing the kitchen floor. And if at all she felt dissatisfied, she knew that she felt it, not that she knew, she felt that she was not good. There was something wrong with her. She was so ashamed, continue with the essay. She was so ashamed to admit her dissatisfaction that she never knew how many other women shared it. If she tried to tell her husband, he didn't understand what she was talking about. She did not really understand it herself. For over 15 years, women in America found it harder to talk about this problem than about sex. So, if they had some kind of dissatisfaction, they never knew how to kind of tell it or speak it out. They couldn't tell her husband because they knew that their husbands would never understand. And because she herself could not understand, she had everything, right? That's what the American magazine said. You've got a husband, you've got children, you've got a beautiful home, you've got all appliances, you are ideal, then why are you feeling dissatisfied? So she never knew how to explain the dissatisfaction that she felt. So how could she, when she couldn't understand what she was feeling, how could she actually ask her husband to understand her? And she couldn't speak it out to anyone, right? For 15 years, women in America found it harder to talk about this problem than about sex. They could speak about sex, but they couldn't speak about this problem because they couldn't understand it themselves. Even the psychoanalysis analyst had no name for it. When a woman went to a psychiatrist for help, as many women did, she would say, I'm so ashamed, or I must be hopelessly neurotic. I don't know what's wrong with women today, a suburban psychiatrist said honestly. I only know something is wrong because most of my patients happen to be women, and their problem isn't sexual. Most women with this problem did not go to see a psychoanalyst. However, There's nothing wrong, really. They would keep telling themselves there isn't any problem. So, slowly this dissatisfaction started creeping into the lives of many women. But they were not able to point out what it was. They had everything, they were ideal according to the society. So, what was the problem? So, they went to this psychoanalyst, some of them, and they couldn't tell what it was. So they kept on saying, I feel so ashamed of myself. I feel so neurotic. What is wrong with me? So, they felt very guilty. And the psychoanalyst or the psychiatrist would say, there's something wrong with women. And it's not a sexual problem. Many of my patients are women. But what is the problem? They themselves don't know, because it's a problem which has no name. So they tried to kind of tell themselves that there was no problem. Right? They tried to reassure themselves that there was no problem. This is what happened. They tried to kind of, ignore the fact that there was some kind of uneasiness within them. They just tried to ignore that. Continue. But on an April morning in 1959, I heard a mother of four having coffee with four other mothers in a suburban development 15 miles from New York say in a tone of quiet desperation, the problem. And the others knew without words that she was not talking about a problem with her husband or her children or her home. Suddenly, they realized they all shared the same problem, the problem that has no name. They began hesitantly to talk about it. Later, after they had picked up their children at nursery school and taken them home to nap, two of the women cried in sheer relief just to know that they were not alone. So in 1959, a woman, Frieden says, I heard a woman of four having coffee with four other mothers, her friends, in a suburban development. She's the first one who voices out the problem. The problem. She says problem. But the others immediately pick up. They understand what she's speaking about because it is something that each of them are feeling. And each of them are afraid to tell the others because they thought it was something wrong with them. Suddenly, it's out of sheer relief, that you realize that others also feel the same thing, and you feel such a great relief, right? To know that you are not alone. You are not alone carrying this burden. There are others who have the same burden like you, and it is a great relief. And two of these women, they just cried out of sheer relief, the relief of getting it out of their chest, because all this while they had been carrying it within themselves. They didn't know how to kind of voice it out, right? Continue. Gradually, I came to realize that the problem that has no name was shared by countless women in America. As a magazine writer, I often interviewed women about problems with their children or their marriages or their houses or their communities. But after a while, I began to recognize the telltale signs of this other problem. I saw the same signs in suburban ranch houses and split levels on Long Island and in New Jersey and Westchester County, in colonial houses in small Massachusetts, on patios in Memphis, in suburban and city apartments and living rooms in Midwest. Sometimes I sense a problem not as a reporter, but as a suburban housewife. For during this time, I was also bringing up my own three children in Rockland County, New York. I heard echoes of the problem in college dormitories and semi-private maternity wards, at PTA meetings and luncheons of the League of Women Voters, at suburban cocktail parties in station wagons waiting for trains, and in snatches of conversation overheard at troughs. The groping words I heard from other women on quiet afternoons where children were at school, or on quiet evenings when husbands work late, I think I understood first as a woman long before I understood their larger social and psychological implications. So, what Frieden says is, I realized that this problem, which had no name, was not a problem of a few women. It was a problem that was shared by countless of women across America in almost all the states. So she says it was not just in suburban houses, it was also there in cities. It was not just in one particular place, it was there everywhere. And she says that, she says as a reporter, she was a journalist, so she says I had always talked to women about problems that they had faced with their children, with their marriages, with their houses, with their communities. But this was a problem which they were not able to put a finger to. right? And she says I was able to sense this problem because not just because I was a journalist, but also because I was a mother. And I started hearing this problem, the mention of this problem in every place, in PTA meetings, college dormitories, in luncheon meetings, at parties, at railway stations, everywhere. And she says, these words were actually very, very secretly brought out by women. They never kind of spoke about it in a bold manner. It was, it was kind of, words were actually kind of doled out very carefully, right? And she says, I was able to understand this as a woman even before I understood the psychological implications of this problem. Because as a woman, I face this. It was not being able to live up to the image that had been created by society. There was an image that had been created by society, and these women were not able to live up to that image. I'll continue. Just what was this problem that has no name? What were the words women used when they tried to express it? Sometimes a woman would say, I feel empty somehow, incomplete, or she would say, I feel as if I don't exist. Sometimes she blotted out the feelings with a tranquilizer, she would take a drug. Sometimes she thought the problem was with her husband or her children, or that what she really needed was to redecorate her house or move to a better neighborhood or have an affair or another baby. Sometimes she went to a doctor with symptoms she could hardly describe a tired feeling. I get so angry with the children, it scares me, I feel like crying without any reason, right? A Cleveland doctor called it the housewife syndrome. A number of women told me about great bleeding blisters that break out on their hands and arms. I call it the housewife's blight, said a family doctor in Pennsylvania. I see it so often lately in these young women with 4, 5, and 6 children who bury themselves in their dishpans. But it isn't caused by detergent, and it isn't cured by cortisone. So this problem had no name, and women were not kind of. I mean, women were not much articulate about it. Whenever they tried to get words, they were not able to put a finger to it. They couldn't express those and kind of tangible images. They would say emptiness, incompleteness, and she would say some of them would even take a drug to forget all these feelings. Some thought it was a problem with her husband, some with their children, and some felt, to get over this feeling, they needed to redecorate their house, move to a better neighborhood, have another baby. But they could never kind of voice it out. They couldn't understand what it was. Because, all this while they were struggling to fit into the image that had been created by society. So, when you feel restless, when they felt unhappy, when they felt wasted, when they felt this kind of, uneasiness, they didn't know how to explain that. They went to a doctor, but they couldn't describe the symptoms. So they say they feel so guilty. Used to feel very guilty. They say, I get angry with the children. And, the doctors are also tired of women coming like this. So many of them gave a name to it. They said the housewife syndrome. Right? And some of these women had bleeding blisters, the wounds that would break out and bleed. And the doctors would say, there was a doctor who said, I see this in women with 4, 5, 6 children. And they're always washing, but it is not caused by detergent. And it cannot be healed by medicine. Sometimes, there are medical, sometimes, you have mental issues. Your psychological problems would actually manifest itself in physical ailment. If you're sick at heart, you also might feel physically ill. You might have all kinds of illnesses. So, this is what these women went through. They didn't know how to explain it, they didn't know how to speak about it, and they were so tired with the kind of restlessness that they were feeling, the kind of emptiness that they were feeling, and the problem that they were not able to kind of voice what it was. So that is, they were kind of they felt so guilty, and they didn't know what to do because they didn't know what exactly the problem was. They were not able to create a concrete realization of the problem that was there in their mind. So this is what these women during those times went through. So Betty Friedan is trying to capture that image. So I'll continue in the next class. I hope you understood this. Do you have any questions? If you have any questions, you can ask me now. Otherwise, we'll continue in the next class. Thank you.